What's going on, people? I am B-Dobbins, FTW, and it's no big secret that a lot of people are unhappy with the direction that the Call of Duty franchise has taken over the last couple years, and today I want to talk about the main reason that Call of Duty sucks the way it does. And as I mentioned in my previous video, to a certain extent, video games are always going to reflect the state of a game developer's target audience. Game devs and publishers sink a lot of time and money into figuring out what it is we want. I'm sure most of you have heard of focus group research, right? And typically they will cater to the majority preference, what a majority of the people they are trying to sell to want the game to look like, because that's always going to be the most profitable course of action for obvious reasons. So in a way, these games say a lot about who we are, or at least who some of us are. The biggest problem in gaming right now is the rotten, lazy, arrogant, and cowardly state of the Call of Duty culture. The masses of gamers who have been essentially brainwashed by Call of Duty and who now constitute the largest single group of gamers that can be effectively catered to at once. And this is bad for Call of Duty. This is why the series has been, in the eyes of many, in decline for some time now. And this is something that's going to continue in Infinite Warfare. But it's not just bad for Call of Duty, it's also bad for every game that tries to win over Call of Duty players by imitating Call of Duty. There was this article that came out a few years ago that really should have gotten more attention than it did, and it's really more relevant today than it even was back then. It's an interview with the head developer for Red Orchestra 2, which was a pretty cool World War II shooter released a few years back, and this guy talks about some of his frustrations with the focus group testing he did for that game. And what he says is that every single playtester they used for research would basically just say the same shit. It doesn't feel like Call of Duty. I want it to be like Call of Duty. And then he says, and I quote, "Just listening to all the niggling, pedantic things that they would complain about that made them not want to play the game, I just thought, I give up. Call of Duty has ruined this whole generation of gamers." End quote. He then talks about his theory for COD's massive success, which is, as we all know, skill gap compression. And for the next 90 seconds, this is all just his quote, okay? He says, and I quote, "The way you compress the skill gap as a designer is you add a whole bunch of randomness. A whole bunch of weaponry that doesn't require any skill to get kills. Random spawns, massive cone fire on your weapons, lots of devices that can get kills with zero skill at all. And you know, it's kind of smart to compress your skill gap to a degree. You don't want the elite players to destroy the new players so bad that the new players can never get into the game and enjoy it. But the skill gap is so compressed that it's like a slot machine. You might as well just sit down at a slot machine and have a thing that pops up and says, I got a kill." They've taken individual skill out of the equation so much. So you see these guys, I see it all the time. They come in to play Red Orchestra and they're like, this game's just too hardcore. I'm awesome at Call of Duty, so there's something wrong with your game. Because I'm not successful at playing this game, it must suck. I'm not the problem, it's your game. These guys, when I actually watch them play, they're actually very poor FPS players. And I don't think it's because they're incapable of getting good. I think it's because they never had to get good. They get enough kills in Call of Duty to feel like they're awesome, but they never really had to develop their FPS skills beyond that. And it's a shame, because when you do that, when you create a shooter like that, you're very limited on the amount of depth that you can give the game. It's all going to be very surface level. Like, I'm sitting here eating cotton candy and I never get any meat and potatoes. End quote. The quality of these games, at the end of the day, will reflect the majority preferences of their audiences. And if Red Orchestra is hearing that shit in their focus groups, you know that's what Halo and Battlefield and every other shooter has been hearing in their focus groups too. And that much is obvious, because over the last couple years, we've seen almost every major shooter franchise try to imitate Call of Duty, try to give those little pussies in the focus groups exactly what their cowardly little turtle cocks wanted. Halo 4 is probably the best example of a game that just straight up did exactly what those focus group testers told them to do. It put in every COD feature you can, sprint, kill streaks, customizable classes, compressed the shit out of the skill gap, abandoned the original Halo formula entirely, and essentially tried to release Call of Duty Halo. And it was the same shit we saw with Battlefield Hardline and Battlefront, just compress the shit out of the skill gap and make it as accessible as possible so that COD players aren't too scared to play the game. All those games listened to the focus groups. All those games tried their hardest to try and win over this massive group of brainwashed Call of Duty players. And all those games sucked ass and they flopped because the competent players like me hated them. And tragically, they still weren't Call of Duty enough for the Call of Duty kids, so it got no love from anyone. And Call of Duty has also sucked ass, but it doesn't flop because even though many players dislike it as much as we did Battlefront and Hardline and Halo 4, because it is on par with those games in terms of depth and quality. The thing is, Call of Duty still retains that core COD audience that those other games were trying to steal. So Call of Duty looks successful. And you see that success and you think, oh, it must be a good game. But no, Call of Duty sucks as much ass as Hardline and Battlefront and all those other games that have flopped. But the only reason Call of Duty doesn't flop is because it's able to retain that cowardly group of players. Whereas those other games failed to attract that group of players. You know what I'm saying? So COD sucks, and then you have other games trying to dumb down and be COD, and then they suck too, because it's like the guy said, you can't have that level of skill gap compression, that level of simplicity, and still retain any meaningful amount of game depth. This is the important part that people don't understand. Part of what I and so many others have loved about a game like Battlefield, for instance, is its depth. There are so many different kinds of weapons, equipment, and vehicles to try out. Which means there's also so many different kinds of enemies to fight. There's so many different play styles. There's always new, unique combat engagements to experience. There's so much replay value because there's so much interesting, cool stuff. There's so many different ways to play the game. But the problem with that depth is that it means higher skill gaps and steeper learning curves for the Call of Duty crowd. They have to learn how to counter every one of those vehicles and pieces of equipment. They have to learn how to use those vehicles and pieces of equipment themselves. They have to think harder, more often. They have to be more creative. They have to have more critical thought. They have to control recoil at long distances. They have to learn the hard way that not every gun can kill every enemy at every distance, like you have in Call of Duty. And with skill gaps and learning curves like that, Battlefield players have to go through what every human being has had to go through whenever they tried something new in history, which is being bad at something at first, being a noob. Anytime you try something that's worth doing, you're gonna be bad at it at first. You're gonna be a noob, and that's a part of the process. But nobody likes being a noob, and Call of Duty has developed a kill slot machine, right? Every map is the same 3 lanes. You got the shortest times to kill in gaming with little to no recoil. All you gotta do is see someone before they see you. And in maps that small and simplistic, it's inevitable that everyone gets to see someone else first at least a few times a match. Every life you are pulling the lever on a slot machine, and the game is specifically designed to make sure that the slot machine gives you a reward at least a few times a match. And the tragedy is that they've convinced everyone that this slot machine is actually a game of skill, when in fact all you're doing is pulling a fucking lever over and over again. It has brainwashed people into thinking they are good at something when they're not. And obviously, if people have to choose between feeling like an all-natural badass on COD and feeling like a total noob on Battlefield, more often than not, they're gonna choose feeling like a badass on COD. And every other major FPS title for the last few years has recognized that's how people feel, and so they tried to turn their games into slot machines too. And the result has been 2 or 3 years of shitty FPS titles, because all those games had to sacrifice their depth. Battlefront, Hardline, Halo 4, because the slot machine can't have depth, because depth inevitably leads to wider skill gaps and steeper learning curves, and the slot machine only works if it's as easy as pulling a lever, so that even, the dumbest 10-year-old can be tricked into thinking is a really talented critical thinker. And my biggest fear is that Battlefield 1 falls into that same trap in some way or another in order to win over COD players. We will continue to miss out on the very best of what gaming has to offer so long as the single largest cohort of gamers remains so fervently attached to the Call of Duty slot machine. And any Call of Duty player who is upset with the direction of the Call of Duty franchise, and I think that's many of us, any of us who harken back to a time of, Call of Duty 4 back when map design was not based around a slot machine. But the reason people loved Call of Duty 4 is it wasn't, 3-lane slot machine maps. It was real maps with real terrain where you could really hide, real cover for real gunfights, and it was still, a casual FPS, but it wasn't a slot machine. It wasn't guaranteed free kills every life. So to, everyone who disliked that trailer, to everyone who was unhappy with Star Wars Battlefront or Battlefield Hardline or any of the recent Call of Duties, we gotta do more than just bitch on the internet. We gotta do more than just bitch at the developers and the publishers. We have to change the rotted Call of Duty culture and convince gamers everywhere that there is more to this hobby than the slot machine that is Call of Duty. The For the Win query of the day is, how the fuck do you think we do that? Thanks for watching. Please remember to rate. This is Batman signing out.